Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. It's been a while since you've seen my face on this channel, 3 weeks in fact, but I wanted to come back to talk about the ALA notable titles for 2024, so that's what I'm going to be doing. If you follow along, you know I had sinus surgery on January 18th, and it has been a long recovery. Still a little puffy, still a little congested, still have a bit of a bruise that's kind of going away. So, ignore all of that and let's just talk about the books. Let's just focus on the books because I've really been wanting to talk about this list, the ALA notable titles, for a while since it was announced. And I always think it's a fun list to look at. There weren't many books on this list that I was unfamiliar with this year. However, there were a couple. And I love lists like this and book prizes and things like that as tools of discovery. So it's always fun for that. I also like to use the ALA notable titles list for fiction. By the way, I should mention we are doing fiction only in this video, not nonfiction. I love to use it as a launching pad to start really formulating my thoughts about the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which I have actually already been doing as I have been recuperating. I've been trying to really narrow in on what I think is going to win the Pulitzer Prize for 2024 and what books might be in the mix for that. The ALA notable list is pretty helpful for that. There is no real marker for what could potentially win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. There's nothing that consistently points to what ultimately ends up winning. For a couple of years, the ALA notable list did seem like it was becoming something of an indicator for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction because a couple of years in a row, the winner came from the ALA notable list. And then it just stopped happening. 2 years in a row, the winner was not from the ALA notable list at all. That was The Night Watchman and then The Netanyahus. And then last year made things even more muddled, actually, because for the first time ever, there was a tie for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And one of the books, Trust by Hernan Diaz, had been on the ALA notable list. And the other one, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, had not been on the ALA notable list. It's still a fun list to look at. So I am going to be talking about the Pulitzer a lot as we go through this list. Just bear with me because, again, I love using this as a launch pad to think about the Pulitzer, and that's just what I do. So we're going to talk about all of the books that are on the fiction list and whether or not they have Pulitzer potential, and we'll sort of go from there. Before we get to the list, I did want to quickly mention the Carnegie Medal, which was announced the same week as the ALA notable list. Of the 3 finalists, the medal went to The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters, which is a book that I actually just hauled. I'll have a link to the book haul where I talk about this at greater length if you'd like more information about this book with a really, truly beautiful cover. I don't think there's Pulitzer potential here because Amanda Peters is Canadian and the Pulitzer Prize is meant to go to an American author. I think for that reason, it doesn't seem like a contender. Issues of citizenship and eligibility can be a little bit murky, but I'm guessing just by the fact that she was born in Canada, it seems like The Berry Pickers will ultimately not be a contender for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Of the 2 finalists, one of them, Denison Avenue by Christina Wong and Daniel Innes, I also don't think will be a contender because it is also very Canadian, but also because it's mixed media. It has a lot of art, practically a graphic novel, but it does have text as well. And I think that seems like it would get confusing or not really be something that the Pulitzer board would gravitate toward. The final finalist for the Carnegie Medal was Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward, which, spoiler, is not on the ALA notable list. And I think that sort of indicates a bit of reticence about this book. I think a lot of people were very excited when it was announced that Jesmyn Ward had a book coming out in 2023. It seemed like it would be a huge contender for the Pulitzer Prize just based on who she is and the work that she has done in the past. And then when the book was released, it felt like excitement or enthusiasm got pretty muted after that. So I still think there's a path for Let Us Descend to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but it feels a little more likely that people would just wait for Jesmyn Ward's next book. However, the fact that it was in contention for the Carnegie, even though it ultimately lost to the Berry Pickers, does indicate that it is still in the mix and still is something that needs to be considered. Again, not being included in the ALA list is not, it's not disqualifying because the ALA has, and its connection to the Pulitzer has been pretty tenuous in recent years. But I just wanted to mention those 3 books. Let's get into the actual ALA notable list for this year. The first title on the list is Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. This is something that I am familiar with. They have short 1 to 2 sentence blurbs for all of the books on the ALA notable list. So I will read all of those to you, and then we'll sort of spin out conversation from there. What they say is, an artist's widow reckons with grief by seeking the truth about her late wife against the backdrop of a richly detailed alternate history. I think this is a book that you definitely have to consider when you are looking at contenders of the Pulitzer, because it has some markers in its favor. It is one of the most critically acclaimed books of 2023. I do think it's a little too experimental, ultimately. And for that reason, I don't really think of it as something that might win the Pulitzer Prize, but I do think you have to consider it as you talk about what might be in contention for the prize. I've heard a lot of really good things about it. I don't have any immediate plans to read it. I don't even have immediate plans to read it before the Pulitzer is announced, because I like to try to read a lot of the big contenders for the Pulitzer before the prize is actually announced. And this is one that I feel somewhat confident holding off on. We'll see if that turns out to be folly or not. But already we have a big heavy hitter from 2023 on the ALA notable titles list for fiction. And that continues with the next one, which is Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is one of the best-selling books of 2023, definitely one of the most recognized as well. And let's just read the blurb that they provide before I talk about it a little more. Incisive allegory and brutal violence combine in a thought-provoking dystopia about the dehumanization of incarcerated people and the power of love. Now, I mean, allegory and talks about dehumanization and the problems of the prison system. All of that would be catnip for the Pulitzer Board. It's the dystopia angle and the fact that it's sort of an action thriller dystopia as well. I think just because of its genre, Chain Gang All-Stars has a really hard road to be considered for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I think genre snobbery would definitely get in the way of it. But Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah is an author whose previous story collection, Friday Black, was beloved by a lot of critics. So definitely seems like an author on the rise. But I feel like because of what this book is and the type of story that it tells, it doesn't feel like a Pulitzer book. But, you know, if they want to start thinking outside of the box, there are definitely components of the book that could make it compelling to a Pulitzer jury or the Pulitzer Board. This is something that I have been wanting to read since it was released, and I have not gotten around to it yet. I do have access to the audio, so I might try to read it before May. We'll see how that goes. Again, I don't feel like this is something I need to rush to get to before the Pulitzer is announced, but it is something that I have been wanting to read anyway, so for that reason, I will probably do it sooner rather than later, if that makes sense. Then we have the first book that I have here in my hands, Dearborn by Ghassan Zenedine. This is a story collection. This is a book that I was delighted to see on this list because I enjoyed this book a good amount and it feels like it had a very quiet reception. So I really hope that people will discover this story collection because of its inclusion on the ALA notable list. And I'm happy to add to the enthusiasm that the ALA had for it by telling you that this is a really great story collection and I enjoyed it a great deal. Here's what they say about it. Stories of heritage, family, and trauma interconnect within a Michigan Arab-American community. So this is a sort of linked story collection. Story collections, to get to the Pulitzer part of this, story collections have had a very rough go of things with the Pulitzer Prize. Historically, not a lot of story collections have won, and a lot of the ones that have won were collected works of an author, although it's been a long time since that happened. And a true story collection has not won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction since Interpretive Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. 2 linked story collections have won since then. A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan and Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. So it feels like linked stories are more of a path to a Pulitzer, and the stories in here are tenuously linked in that they're all happening in the same community. So you might hear, if someone owns a store in one story, that store might come up in another story later on. So they're sort of linked, which kind of makes it in that eligibility thing where linked stories seem to have a better chance. However, I don't think there's much of a path for this to the Pulitzer, but I do think it's a delightful book. I do think it has a really great sense of humor, and I would absolutely recommend it to you. And I hope that more people end up reading this book, because I had a good time with it. I thought it was really good, and I'm happy to see it here on the ALA notable title list. Then we have Hangman by Maya Binyam. This was one of the books that I was really unfamiliar with. And here's what it says. A man embarks on a surreal journey to visit his ailing brother, returning to his home country after years abroad. And this is a book that, when I looked into it a little further, does seem like it could have potential for the Pulitzer, because it has been sort of low-key simmering in a couple of areas, and it doesn't have a lot of the big name recognition that some of the other titles that are to come on this list have. But it feels like it could be a stealth contender. So I am going to continue to think about this book as I prepare my predictions for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It does sound like a really interesting book as well. I did check, my library does not have a copy, but I did recommend that they purchase a copy. And if they do, I would totally read Hangman by Maya Binyam. Then we have another book that I have, and one that has no Pulitzer contention because it is not an American book. It is In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This feels like a bit of a cilantro book, because there have been people who read it and just absolutely fell in love with it and think it's brilliant, and there have been people who read this and thought that was kind of terrible. So it'll be interesting to finally read it for myself and figure out where I fall on this list. Clearly the ALA was a fan, because they included it in their notable titles list for 2024. Here's what they say. A love story of two young British men who leave their boarding school for the trenches of World War I. And again, this feels like some people have read it and just absolutely loved it, and some people have read it and really not been into it at all. I can't wait to read it at some hopefully soon. I don't know when. I don't have plans to prioritize it, but I do definitely want to read In Memoriam by Alice Wynne and find out where I fall on that spectrum of people who have sort of cilantro reactions to this book. We'll find out when I eventually get to it. Now we get to one of the heavy hitters on this list, Northwoods by Daniel Mason. One of the most celebrated books of 2023, I'd say an absolute contender for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I am part of a Discord group of people who like to predict the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and somebody did a sort of test case. If you were to predict the Pulitzer today, what would your guess be? And most people said Northwoods by Daniel Mason. So it could even be my ultimate prediction. I'm still trying to decide what my ultimate prediction will be, but this feels like a serious contender. I have not read it yet because I've had a really slow start to my reading year, first because of just general bit of a reading slump in January, and then since the nasal surgery, I have not made a lot of progress on anything. So I really want to read this before the announcement of the prize in May. Here's what they say about it. A New England forest endures the animal and human lives that first inhabit and later haunt it. So it's a house that is built early on in the United States, and then generation after generation, it's a story of who inhabits the house. Not all of the people that it follows are human. It is a bit experimental, and the fact that it is a bit experimental has made some people feel that maybe it doesn't have as much of a chance to win the Pulitzer as we might think. It has a bit of a mixed media element in it, which is why I kind of wanted to make sure I had the physical copy of the book, because there are things in the book that I feel like I would want to be able to see. And some of it, I feel like I would want to be able to see the layout of this section in particular, because it looks a little bit like poetry. So I feel like print is the way to go for me for this, but we'll see. I think it's a heavy contender for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Daniel Mason has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize before, and yeah, huge Pulitzer possibilities here, and not surprised at all to see it on the ALA notable titles list. Then we have Open Throat by Henry Hoke, which is a novella, and I believe the audio is on Scribd, and it's only like 2 hours. So I am hoping to listen to it at some point. Here's what they say about it. A mountain lion wrestles with the encroaching human world and the desire to both join and destroy it in a brief fever dream of a novel. There has been a bit of disagreement about how much of a Pulitzer contender this might be, because it is from the perspective of an animal. It's kind of a fever dream, which makes it a little experimental. And what they don't say in that little 1 to 2 sentence description is that I believe it is also a queer mountain lion. So that adds an element of like, will the Pulitzer board recognize that? I don't know. it feels like a long shot right now, but it does sound like a really interesting book, and it is one that I would like to read, especially since it's so short. The audio is, like I said, 2 hours, somewhere in that realm. So, and the fact that it's on Scribd, I will read it. I probably will end up reading it before the Pulitzer announcement, but I don't think there's much of a threat that it will end up winning the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but we'll find out. Then we have Same Bed, Different Dreams by Ed Park. Here's what they say about it. An audacious experimental novel about the history of Korea, real and imagined. It does sound like a really interesting book. It is very sci-fi, and for that reason, again, because of the genre, I think it kind of ends up in the same situation as Chang'e All-Stars. I think genre snobbery would prevent it from being considered for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And again, the fact that it is kind of experimental. The Pulitzer Prize does sometimes go for experimental books. I mean, A Visit from the Goon Squad has a chapter that is told in PowerPoint. However, it's in the package of a linked story collection. So, and The Overstory is a very experimental book. It feels like they like experimental things, but they don't want to tip the boat out too far. So I don't know where that leaves Same Bed, Different Dreams. I don't think it would be too much of a Pulitzer contender, but I've heard a lot of really good things about it. I have not thought about reading it. I don't do a lot of science fiction in my life, but if you have read it, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, and maybe I will reconsider. Then we have another huge contender for the Pulitzer Prize, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. Here's what they say. Black, Jewish, and European residents of Chicken Hill cleverly navigate the discriminatory and hypocritical social structure forced upon them by white Christian America in the mid-20th century. Part of why I haven't really decided where I stand on the Northwoods and its chances of winning the Pulitzer is that I feel like until I've read Northwoods, my heart is really rooting for The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. I'm a big fan of James McBride, for one thing. I think he should have already won a Pulitzer Prize for The Good Lord Bird, which is this book faced out on my shelf right there. I thought he was going to be a huge contender for Deacon King Kong, which ended up not even being nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. So there's a sense that he is past due already, and I think that is one of the things that is harming Jesmyn Ward. She felt like someone who was becoming past due for a Pulitzer Prize. But since enthusiasm for Let Us Descend has been pretty mixed, it feels like all of that energy is now going to James McBride. He is the author who feels wildly past due for a Pulitzer Prize, who wrote a book that people genuinely love this year. This has been popping up in a lot of places. So I feel like I'm leaning toward The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride as my prediction for this year, but that's mostly because my heart is attached to this book, and I would love to see James McBride have a Pulitzer Prize. I really liked The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store a lot, so I would love to see it recognized, but I can't really say until I read The Northwoods, so I need to do that, and then maybe I'll be ready to do my predictions at that point. So I feel like there's enormous Pulitzer potential here. Definitely not surprised to see this on the ALA notable title list. And between this and Northwoods, it does feel like there is potential for the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for 2024 to be on the ALA notable list. But we'll have to see how that goes. Huge Pulitzer potential for that one. Then we have The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. An imprisoned 12-year-old boy is haunted during the Jim Crow era while his older sister grapples with racist bureaucracy to secure his release. I've heard good things about this author. I don't know if I pronounced her name correctly. Let me know if I did in the comment section down below. She writes kind of sci-fi fantasy horror type books, I think more on the end of horror, and I don't tend to read a lot of those, so I have not really considered reading one of these books. I've heard good things about The Reformatory. If you think I should reconsider, let me know in the comment section down below. I don't think there's really Pulitzer potential here, just based on genre again. The final book on the list of ALA notable titles for fiction for 2024 is YN by Esther Yi. A surreal, slippery novel traces a woman's obsession with a K-pop star as it spirals into questions of the self and identity. This has had surprising staying power, and it's been popping up in some really interesting places that could potentially be indicators, because really, there is no indicator of what could win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So really, we're all just guessing. But YN has been popping up in some interesting places that make you think, it feels like it could be in the mix. But again, I think sort of similar to the biography of X, I think it might just be a little too out there for the Pulitzer. So I feel like you have to consider it if you're someone like me who wants to think about the Pulitzer Prize, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the Pulitzer Prize, yes. But I don't know how much of a factor it would actually be to win, being honest. And I have no plans to read it, although if you have read it and think I should change my mind, let me know in the comment section down below. And then really quickly, let's just cover some omissions. I already mentioned that Let Us Descend was not on the ALA notable list. I am not entirely surprised by that because, again, it's been a very cilantro book. And it feels like on the love it or hate it spectrum, people trend toward either just disliking it or just feeling kind of meh about Let Us Descend. So it's not surprising to me at all that it was not on the list. But we also don't have Absolution by Alice McDermott, which definitely feels like a Pulitzer contender to me. Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, which I think Tom Lake is kind of a stealth contender for the Pulitzer. I think it has a better chance than a lot of people would think. So I'm going to be thinking about that a lot, but it did not make it onto the ALA notable title list. We also don't have Blackouts by Justin Torres, which won the National Book Award. And I think the fact that it won the National Book Award alone kind of disqualifies Blackouts from consideration for the Pulitzer. I think you have to think about it, but it just does not happen very often that something that wins the National Book Award goes on to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. There have been exceptions. Maybe Blackouts will be one of them, but I think it's also a very experimental book. It's really about queer history and queer identity. And, you know, you have Less, which won a Pulitzer Prize, which is very much about a queer identity. But I don't know. I just don't know if Blackouts... I'm going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not it is something that could break through that. And then we don't have The Deluge by Stephen Markley or This Other Eden by Paul Harding. Paul Harding obviously already has a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which means he has a very steep road to get another one. You know, Colson Whitehead recently got a second one. It's something that does not happen very often. I feel like we need another couple of years to see if that could be changing. Maybe if somebody else does win a second Pulitzer, then maybe we'll see a changing tide where the Pulitzer board has become more willing to award a second prize. Until that happens, I think we have to consider This Other Eden a long shot. And it was another cilantro book. Some people really liked it. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize, but some people really did not feel very enthusiastic about it at all. So I'm not entirely surprised not to see it on the ALA notable list. But there you go. That is the ALA notable list for 2024. I'd love to hear what you think of this list, what you think you would have liked to see on it. And if you have thoughts about what might win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, let me know. Because as I said, I'm really spending a lot of time thinking about what I think will win the Pulitzer this year. So let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. As always, I will be back and I appreciate your time. I know, again, it's been a while since you've seen my face. I'm going to try to work my way back into posting regularly again. Thank you for the patience your patience while I have been healing. It's still in process, but you know, what can you do? And again, I appreciate your time and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.